This is Jonathan, Hartford Baptist Church, and welcome to episode 8 of our study through 1 Thessalonians. We're still in chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. We didn't get finished last episode. There's a lot going on here. We basically got kind of bogged down in verse 4. But do want to look at, I'm not going to read it all to you. We read it all last time, but I want to look at, we mentioned that I'd come back to verse 3, which reads, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual morality." One thing I want to look at is, well, before we go there, sanctification, just a reminder, this is the process of becoming more Christ-like, where we basically, we have more good in us for Him and less sin. We start cutting out sin. We replace the bad with the good, becoming more like Him. And of course, God participates with us to help us do that. But part of that is abstaining from sexual morality. Why sex? Is that there's got to be a reason that He's asked us to abstain from that. And how does this have to play with our looking more holy? As the NET in the middle says, that you become holy, that you keep away from sexual morality. So they're connected. And it's just like, okay, why are they connected? One thing I want to look at, the word here for holiness or sanctification, refers to personal dedication, which I'll highlight it in blue here in that little bitty screen. Personal dedication to the interests of a deity. Other words you can translate as holiness, consecration, or sanctification. Certainly we see two translations use two of those three. But it's dedication to a deity. So part of our dedication to God, part of our loyalty to Him, is abstaining from sexual morality. And there's a theological reason to it. It's just not the physical stuff that we all know: sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, destroyed marriages. These are symptoms or consequences of the actual act of sin. It's not the primary reason why God said not to do this. These are just consequences of basically the punishment we deserve for doing such. But there is a greater reason why God has called us to avoid things, other than just, HIV and things like that. But then also the other thing I want to look at is how this is related to, verse 6. Sexual morality, we're just talking about sexual morality, but Paul says not to do this. Verse 6, that no one transgress and wrong his brother in this manner, because the Lord is avenger in all these things. How does this harm another person? If we're having consenting sex even before marriage or outside of marriage with someone else, how does this hurt anybody? Well, we can kind of understand if you're married, you've hurt your spouse. We get that. But it doesn't say your spouse. It's implying some other guy. Of course, and Paul is probably thinking, men are more prone to do this, so you're wronging another man. But it doesn't say her husband, just as some other guy. So how can that be? Especially if you're single and you're single, the other person's single. How does this do wrong to others? And there is an answer to that as well. And to get a better idea of how this wrongs others, we're going to kind of work this backwards. We're going to start, about the same time. We're going to go to Ephesians chapter 5, and this will help us answer really both questions. What's the theological significance, and how does this harm others? How does sexual morality harm others? In Ephesians chapter 5, if you're not familiar with this passage, you see that in verse 22, that subheading, wives and husbands. Paul's talking about marriage here and describes how husbands should treat their wives, wives should treat their husbands. But then it goes on to verse 31. He begins to quote a passage in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. That was about marriage. It was context of Adam and Eve. And he's obviously using the context of marriage discussion here. He's got done talking about marriage. And this verse contains the word like wife. He's obviously talking about marriage. But there's a more profound theological meaning, a higher meaning to this as well. This verse was a type and shadow of something much greater. We're going to talk about what that is. Reading starting in verse 31. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Sounds pretty intimate, pretty close there. So we've got that. Obviously he's talking about marriage. And of course, the become one flesh is referring to now sex. But in verse 32, he gives a greater meaning to this. He's saying it's just not about a husband and a wife. The mystery is profound. And I am saying this refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Obviously, this verse has application to husband and wife. The words are used. It's used in the context of marriage, but he gives us a greater meaning that this passage refers to Christ and the church. And certainly, this isn't the only time we see marriage used to describe Christ and the church. Revelations does it a lot. Christ is the groom, and we are the bride. Church is the bridegroom. After his second coming, we're gathered at the marriage supper of the Lamb, and symbol of close fellowship in that vision. Marriage and sex within marriage, the Genesis 2:24 verse, there is a theological greater significance in Christ and the church than just having sex between a man and a woman inside a marriage. But marriage and sex inside of marriage is a type and shadow. It is kind of I'll give you a parallel in a little bit, but it's a type and shadow that points to something greater. So a man and a woman, when they get married and they become one flesh, this is a gift from God, the marriage and the sex, to give them an idea of what a relationship with Christ is like. Not that a relationship with Christ is a sexual relationship. I'm not saying that, so don't misinterpret that. But there's really no act where two people become closer than the sexual activity. And God has given that as a gift of just not procreation, just not for men and women's pleasure, but also so we can better understand the relationship between Christ and the church. This is what Paul's saying here in Ephesians. Anytime that we commit the sin of porneia, the sexual morality outside of marriage between man and a woman, we dilute that gift. We water it down. If we have sex with 20 other people before we get married, we have diluted down that intimacy with our current wife. And we have also robbed her of that intimacy. Even if she has waited for marriage to have sex, but the husband hasn't, he has robbed his wife of something special, because his wife will never have all of her husband. She doesn't have that private intimacy, that one-on-one intimacy. He has shared that with other people. And so what Paul is saying in Thessalonians, when you wrong a brother, he's saying you've robbed somebody else of this gift. If you've lay with their wife, you have robbed him. Even if she was single, you were single, and that guy's not even married yet, but they get married later on, you have robbed his marriage of the faithfulness that's supposed to be represented in Christ and the church. Because Christ doesn't cheat on the church. Christ doesn't commit acts of betrayal to the church. The church is the one who always does the idolatry. And certainly we do adultery and other acts of sexual morality, but we are commanded not to. And that is so we can understand the faithfulness and the closeness that the church has with the relationship with Christ. Anytime we commit a act of sexual morality, we're robbing a piece. We're doing damage to this type and shadow of something greater to come. A parallel to kind of look at this is the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, we know we got the bread and we got the juice or the wine. So unless you're Catholic, you know that the bread is not really Jesus' flesh, and that the wine or the juice is not really his blood, but they are symbols of something greater, being Jesus' actual body and blood. The thing and his work that brought in the new covenant, and we are commanded to participate in the Lord's Supper till his second coming. But the act of participating in the Lord's Supper is the type and foreshadow, looking forward to him coming back. But also, we kind of look back as well, something he actually did. It reminds us of what he did. And it reminds us that he's going to come back. And so the marriage and sex within marriage is another way that God gives us to, as we'll call it the Methodists will call a means of grace. That's what sex with inside marriage is. Marriage itself is considered a means of grace, and it is a taste of what the goodness God has to offer to us. Is that type and foreshadow something to come? So when we commit sex of sexual morality, we just don't do physical harm to the now. We also do spiritual harm to us and those around us. We rob others of a gift from God. We've diluted their gift as well as our gift. And that's why God commands us to avoid sexual morality, because the more we commit it, the more we lose the significance of the act of sex within inside marriage, the importance of it, the specialness of it, if you will. Of course, if you've already messed up, um, which as many of us have, how you can't take it back, you can't fix it. But what you can do is stop doing it, um, and stop the diluting of it, and move forward with the same command that Paul gives the Thessalonians. Certainly, this church that grew up in a society of rampant sexual morality, Paul just commanded, "Hey, stop it, abstain from it." Now you just stop. That's what we do. We stop. We kind of the damage is done, but you just stop. You move forward, and you get back on the sanctification, the act of becoming holy. You haven't done too much. You haven't done enough damage where you can't, change course and start working on your sanctification. That's what Paul's telling the church at Thessalonica. Because surely almost every young man in this city, even based upon secular records of how the city behaved, had participated in acts of sexual morality. So Paul's saying, hope's not lost if you already messed up, but you need to stop. Get your body under control. Get a husband, get a wife. Don't burn with passion. God has called you to be holy. He's called you to dedicate yourself to Him. And we've actually probably covered a lot. I think we probably went way over on time. But I will leave you there, and I will see you next time. God bless.